My name's Peter Kilpatrick. I'm currently the Dean of Engineering here at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also a professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering. I currently live about 2 blocks south of town, of campus, just off Notre Dame Avenue. And I'm originally from Montgomery, Alabama. My dad was in the Air Force. I was born on an Air Force base in Alabama, but I've lived in 11 different places, including South Bend, Indiana. So because my dad moved around all over the world, I lived on the island of Guam for 2 years. I lived in Izmir, Turkey for 2 years. My K through 12 education was everywhere. And then I was just telling a person at the coffee shop this morning, I had always planned on going to Stanford as an undergraduate, and I applied and got in, but they gave me a very small scholarship. And I was concerned my dad wasn't going to be able to afford the tuition. So I applied to a small liberal arts college in California called Occidental College. And I went there and studied chemistry and math, and I met my wife there. And then, and that was a momentous thing, because that's how I became a Catholic. And I'll tell you that story in a little bit. And then when I was a junior in college, I worked as a chemist and decided I really did not like that. And so I sort of had a crisis of, well, what am I going to do when I graduate? Because I don't really want to be a chemist. And I discerned that chemical engineering might be a really good path for me. So I started taking classes at Caltech my senior year. They were a sister school to Occidental. You could take classes there without paying any extra tuition. And so I applied to PhD programs in chemical engineering and went to the University of Minnesota and graduated there with my PhD in 1983. So this experience that I had with working as a chemist at night doing analytical chemistry convinced me that I didn't want to work as a chemist. And so I actually considered 3 different things. I considered going to graduate school in chemistry. I figured, well, if I get a PhD, maybe I'll do something that's a little more thought-provoking, a little more intriguing than working as a bachelor's level chemist. I applied in chemical engineering because I always liked quantitative things and I was always pretty practical. And I applied to medical school. And my medical school interviews were really interesting. Convinced me very quickly that I didn't want to be a doctor. And so I think the message there is, if you're not exactly sure what you want to do a little exploration. Don't be afraid to explore what it looks like to be a medical student or a medical doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or a professor or working in a research lab. I think people in STEM should have the whole range of experiences as they try to figure out what they want to do if they don't know what they want to do. But if you do know what you want to do, go for it. And so somewhere along the line, I discovered that I loved the quantitative side of chemistry and I loved the practical side of chemistry, and that's chemical engineering. So when I figured that out, and I loved intellectual discovery. So when I figured all that out, I mean, it was obvious I needed to go get a PhD in chemical engineering and then figure out what I wanted to do after that. And when I graduated or just before I was about to graduate, I actually had about 15 different interviews. I had several interviews with companies, and I had several with universities. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but when I went on my interview at North Carolina State University to become a faculty member there, I fell in love with the place. And so I think one of the messages there is explore enough that something kind of captures your heart, and you're sure from that experience that that's what you want to do. And that's what happened. November of 1982, I went on this interview trip, and the place and the people there just kind of captured my heart, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. If you ask most students, why did you pick this discipline to study in college? Typically they'll say, well, I studied this in high school and I loved it, or I had this teacher and I became intrigued by this discipline. So, my pathway was pretty similar. I had a wonderful teacher in high school who taught an advanced chemistry course. And I went to a high school in Mesa, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix, and the school had wonderful curriculum in science and math. And this was in the early 70s, so they had a bunch of AP courses. And I took I took an AP chemistry course in my junior year, and then in my senior year, I took an advanced chemistry course that was mostly a lab-based course, and I loved it. So I decided, well, I think I enjoy this enough that I'll pursue it in college. But I also loved math, so I more or less double majored. I was one course shy of a double major in math and chemistry. And then I had this work experience that convinced me that I really didn't want to be a chemist, even though I loved chemistry. So I loved the intellectual pursuit of chemistry. I just didn't like the work part of chemistry. But again, I think you learn from your experiences, and you should be asking yourself as a student, what part of what I'm doing, turns me on? What part of it do I really enjoy, and do I get passionate about? And for me, it was always answering questions, answering, who, what, why, those sorts of questions. And so intellectual discovery, and in particular in science and in particular in chemistry, it was clear that was something that really animated me and enabled me to become passionate about something. And then after this work experience that I had in college, it was clear that the intellectual discovery in chemistry for me had to be pretty practical and pretty applied, or I wasn't going to be as animated by it. And that, if you add up all those, connect the dots, that points right in the direction of a academic career in chemical engineering. I don't think that's an accident. I think things come together because we get pulled in certain directions, and we either respond to the pull or we don't. And I think I was just very fortunate, very blessed to respond to this pull. And I think that as students and as STEM professionals, we have to be sensitive to, are we being pulled, are we being called, are we being directed, are we being drawn in a certain direction in our lives? And I think if you kind of become introspective and reflective, I think you'll discover, absolutely I'm being drawn. And I just need to decide, do I want to respond to that or not? But I don't think I'm special. I think everyone gets that treatment. My parents and our family were what I would call ceremonial churchgoers. my mom and my dad always took us to church on Sunday. We lived on Air Force bases all around the world. And I think their faith was a pretty private thing for them. It wasn't something that they expressed or, talked much about. But we would go to church on Sunday. When I was 11 years old, I became friends with a young man on one of the Air Force bases we lived on who was the son of the Methodist minister at this Air Force base. And we became good friends, and I had what I would characterize as a little bit of a spiritual awakening, and I was formally baptized. And my parents, I think, were a little bit concerned that I wasn't mature enough to be making an important decision about my spiritual life. And maybe they were right. After we moved from that Air Force base to another place, I didn't really practice my faith life much. And by the time I was in college at Occidental College, I would say I was more of an agnostic than I was a believer. But I had spiritual moments that, in retrospect, were pretty obvious to me, where I would sense God's presence in my life and I would respond to it. And so when I met my wife and started dating her, she was a cradle Catholic, and I remember going to a Mass with her in it must have been either our junior or senior year in college, and thinking to myself, this is such a strange ritual, sit down, stand up, say a few words, kneel, genuflect, it just seemed like people were putting on a play, and I didn't have the script, and everyone else seemed to have the script, and it was a little off-putting. And then we went to another Mass I remember in Berkeley. We were looking at graduate schools at that time, and we went to this campus Mass in Berkeley, and that was a little, a guitar Mass in the mid to late 70s. And so I didn't think much about it. We arranged to get married right after we graduated. I had to go through pre-Cana with my wife because she wanted to get married in the church. I went and spoke to the parish priest, her parish priest in her hometown in California, and he said, well, if you're going to get married in the church, you have to sign this form that says you promise to raise your children Catholic. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I said, they're going to choose for themselves. And he said, well, that's okay. You're not going to get married in my church. And I said, well, you don't understand. My wife wants to get married in your church. He said, great, sign the form. And, we had a little bit of a, Tijuana standoff there for a little while. And finally, under duress, I signed the form because I knew my wife, Nancy, really wanted to get married in the church. So that was the last I really thought about, church or Catholicism, because we didn't have any children until our third year of marriage. She got pregnant with our oldest daughter, Elizabeth. And about halfway through her pregnancy, she said, we promised that we would raise the kids Catholic. And she hadn't been going to church. I certainly wasn't going to church. So we went to this parish in Minneapolis where I was going to graduate school, and we met the parish priest there, a fellow named Tom Comer. And we said, as you can see, my wife's pregnant, and we'd like to arrange for the child to be baptized after Nancy gives birth. And he kind of narrowed his eyes, and he looked at Nancy and me, and he says, I don't think I've ever seen you here at my parish before. And I said, well, no, that's true. We haven't gone to Mass. He said, well, I can't baptize a child of non-practicing adults. And I looked at my wife and I said, was that in the fine print, when I signed this thing back in California? And I went to my first Mass in Minneapolis, and I'll never forget it. It was about an 80-year-old priest named Father Corbett, and he had a shaky voice, and he told the story of a couple in Chicago that gave birth to a little baby boy who had Down syndrome and a malformed esophagus. And the doctor counseled the parents not to fix the esophagus and to let the baby die. And I'm listening to this priest give this homily, and I'm looking at my wife, 6-7 months pregnant, and I just said, I want to be a part of that family. I want to be a part of what that guy believes up there. And that was the beginning, I think, of just a wonderful moment of grace where I fell in love with what the church stands for and what the church believes and, the gospel of life. And, there were bumps in the road in my coming to faith, but they were pretty minor. I went through RCIA. I had a lot of questions about papal infallibility and Immaculate Conception and all that. And the priest that was instructing me was a very wise man, and he said, well, Peter, have you ever prayed about that? Have you ever gotten down on your knees and asked God to give you grace and guidance and help you in your understanding? And I admitted to him, no, I've never done that. He says, I highly recommend it. And, I think anyone who's been through an experience of coming to faith and who has learned how to pray and receive the faith, I think would understand and recognize what I went through. Nothing special. It's my story. It has a lot of meaning to me. I feel very fortunate. And I look at people who don't have faith, and I think to myself, why me and not them? Why do I have a luminous faith, a faith that's never deserted me in fact, I've never even questioned my faith now for 36 years. And I look at that and I go, why is that? Why was I lucky? And I think it's just a matter of responding to God's call. I think everyone is called by God. Everyone, He knocks on the door of your heart. And I think you just have to hear it and respond to it. So I had this interview at North Carolina State University. There was just a wonderful dear friend of mine named Hal Hoffenberg. He was the department chair at North Carolina State University in chemical engineering. And I just hit it off with him. He went on to become, sort of the vice chancellor or the chancellor's special operations guy when Larry Monteith was the chancellor of NC State. So I lost touch with him for about 5 or 10 years. Even though I was at the same university, he was busy doing things in the higher administration. But when I got to NC State, I had another mentor, a fellow named Ruben Carbonell, who's a pretty well-known chemical engineer. He's in the National Academy. And he kind of took me under his wing, and we did collaborative research, and I did my own research, and I rose up through the ranks, became an associate professor with tenure and a full professor, and then he became the department chair at NC State, and he asked me to be the associate department chair, which means I got to do a lot of the work that he didn't want to do as department chair. That's typically how academic departments work when they try to flesh out the administrative load. And so I did that until 1999, and at that point, he had just become the co-director of a science and technology center that NC State had won with UNC. It's an NSF-funded center, and he asked me to be the department chair. And I said, well, doesn't the department have to vote on this? And NC State's governance was a little different than a lot of schools. They had heads instead of chairs, and so it was a little autocratic how chairs and heads got picked. But I think most of the faculty were comfortable with my becoming the department head. And so I was the head there of chemical engineering and then eventually chemical and biomolecular engineering. So they renamed their department like most departments did until 2007. And at that point, Notre Dame approached me and asked me if I would come and be the dean of engineering here. And I had no desire ever to be a department head or to be a dean. If you ask most faculty here at Notre Dame in engineering, they would tell you, I don't want to be the department chair or the dean. I mean, in some ways, administrators at universities are not looked upon as faculty. They're looked upon as other creatures who have left the faculty ranks to go over to the dark side. And, part of being the dean of engineering is a wonderful thing because, as I like to say, you get to build the big team. And that's a really wonderfully rewarding thing to do. But a lot of it is having to know when to say yes and when to say no. And saying no to a lot of people is not a lot of fun. So anyway, I've enjoyed my time as dean of engineering. It's been wonderful to see the College of Engineering here at the University of Notre Dame grow the way that it's grown. We've doubled just about everything you can think of in the last 10 years, although we're still working on doubling the size of our faculty. It's been a really rewarding opportunity, but it wasn't something that I sought out. It was something that I was pursued on. And I think those are the kind of people that you want to be academic administrators, is people that aren't, campaigning for the job, but people that are pressed into service. So the only reason I'm at Notre Dame is because of my faith. I would have had zero interest in being at Notre Dame if I didn't have a Christian faith and a Catholic faith. I was perfectly happy in Raleigh, North Carolina at NC State, and it's a wonderful university, but it's a secular university. And you can't get away with talking about your faith at a secular public university. It's not allowed, at least not publicly. You can do it privately. And I think that's one of the most important things about a place like Notre Dame is what Notre Dame says is, no, religion is not a private thing. It's a public thing, and it belongs in the public square. And we have a right to talk about our faith in a nation that was founded on the notion that religion should be freely practiced by anyone. It's sort of inscribed in our Bill of Rights and Constitution and the whole bit. So how does engineering interact with faith? Well, there's a wonderful quote by Pope Emeritus Benedict where he says, a Christian is obligated to serve society in proportion to the power that they wield in society. And I take that quote and I understand it that, in my opinion, very few professionals wield more power than engineers wield. Engineering is the application of science and math and design for the good of humankind. And it's powerful. I mean, if you think about the society we live in today, it's all because of engineering. Our transportation systems, our communication systems, our energy systems, it's all engineering, every bit of it. Now, it's built on science, and it takes politics and sociology and all that to implement it, but it's all based on the application of engineering. So I think as Christians and as Catholics, we have a real solemn obligation to apply the power that we wield as engineers in service of society, in service of our society here in the U.S., in service of the global society, solving problems of injustice and human poverty, integral human development. I mean, all the global challenges that you can think of that are embodied in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are all going to be solved with engineering. And so we have sort of a heavy burden. If you're an engineer, I think you have, and you're a Christian, I think you have to look at what you pursue in your life and say, am I putting my skills, talents, and abilities at the service of humankind in proportion to how much power I wield? And if you're not, I think you're going to have a lot to answer for. I mean, that's a great question. What advice would I give to young engineers who are faith-filled engineers and who are also, skilled and talented and have this wonderful opportunity to practice their profession but also their faith? I guess the one major piece of advice I would give, and maybe it's going to sound a little simplistic, but learn to be quiet and go within yourself to identify what God's will is for your life. I think we live in a world right now that is so noisy and so busy that the value of silence and the value of prayer and the value of reflection and introspection is in danger of being lost. And I don't think you can know what God's will is for your life unless you spend time in prayer, unless you reflect, unless you, be still and know that He is God. And so that would be my biggest piece of advice. Develop a habit of learning how to pray and learning how to be quiet, learning how to look within yourself. Because I think, God has a lot to share. And He has a lot that He wants to say to you personally. And He has it sounds a little trite, but He has a plan that He would love for you to discover. And you're not going to discover it unless you work at it. And I'm not saying I've found my plan and I'm, executing. I'm just as clueless as the rest of us. But I do try to listen on occasion, and I find when I do, I have so much more clarity in my life and so much more peace and purpose. And that's such a wonderful gift. I mean, it's what person in the world wouldn't want their life to be more peaceful and tranquil and serene and satisfying and joyful? Who doesn't want that? And I think it's there for everyone. I think you just have to go inside yourself and find God and find what He wants for you. So that would be my advice. Well, as a university administrator it seems like everyone wants a piece of the dean's time, and it's mostly to ask for things, or to have me meet faculty candidates, or to sit on a committee, or so. It's in all candor, it's not very glamorous. It's a lot of meetings, a lot of giving of my time, and I look back on that and I go, I hope when I do that, I can be helpful, and I can be authentic, and I can be sincere, and I can be of value to someone else. Sometimes you wonder, are all the little meetings really being productive? I do research, and I've got a couple of research projects going right now, and I really enjoy my research, and I like lecturing to students when I get a chance to do that. I like sharing with students, but the majority of it's pretty unglamorous. It's just going about the business of trying to fulfill all my obligations to the university. I also do some professional service. I'm the chair of an organization called the Global Engineering Deans Council, and that I'm in the second year of my term on that, and that takes a lot of time and energy. But at the end of the day, I try to get to Mass every day over in our chapel at Stinson Remick. In fact, this morning we had a packed house. We probably had 40 people there at Mass for Father Kevin Grove. And so I try to take that time to start the day right. And but that's pretty much what my day looks like.